So, going back now to discussing the clashes between Pope Paul IV and Philip II. So, the Pope made a wide distinction between Philip II, King of Spain, of Naples, and the Milanese, and Philip II, the consort of the Queen of England. So it seems that he liked him inasmuch as he was married to Mary Tudor, and at least nominally the King of England, but that he didn't like him to the extent that he was a political rival in other ways. Charles V, Philip II, and Ferdinand I. So Charles V, Philip II's father, Holy Roman Emperor. Philip II, successor of Charles V in the Kingdom of Spain and the other Habsburg territories. And also Ferdinand I, Holy Roman Emperor, successor to Charles V in that respect, had all opposed the election of Paul IV, with whose political opinions they were well acquainted. So they remember he was old when he was elected, Paul IV. He said, as a cardinal, he said that if God wills that I should be sovereign pontiff, the emperor cannot hinder my election. I shall thus be much better satisfied with it, since I shall be indebted for it only to God. So remember, we studied last year about how the Roman mob used to cause such interference in the papal elections that the Pope decreed that the Holy Roman Emperor had to confirm the election, that was part of the election process, that the Holy Roman Emperor had to confirm it. But remember, that was in the time of the emperors whose names were Otto, and they were much more friendly to the Holy See than the emperors currently are. So that's definitely would not be in favor of the Holy See at this point. It's all political rivalry. This doesn't have anything to do with the faith. It's political rivalries. Clashes between the Holy Roman Emperors and kings of Spain with the Pope, to the extent that he is also himself a temporal ruler and has his own temporal interests. We've seen these clashes have nothing to do with the faith. Clashes of faith are like with heretics, with Luther and people who followed him, and Henry VIII, Edward VI, and then we'll see shortly also Elizabeth in England. Those are rivalries. Those are clashes that have to do with, obviously, with the faith. But with Philip II, whatever clashes there were, they were political. So again, also on the political front, the new Pope, Paul IV, had hardly ascended to the throne of Peter when he received a deputation consisting of a bishop and 2 noblemen from England. They came in the name of the king and queen, so in the name of Philip II and Mary Tudor, to make the act of submission to the pontifical authority. So while the Pope is clashing with Philip II, on other fronts, he's receiving ambassadors who are from him, at least in theory, from him, coming from England. But remember, Mary Tudor is the one who really ran things in England while she was alive. Philip II was, yes, he had the title King of England, but he wasn't there enough of the time to really rule the country. Also, given the speed of communications at the time, it was impossible to do anything from any distance. Even from, Spain to England is, so you take distances in North America, that's a relatively small distance, but even that, it would have been very difficult to rule from Spain. Even had he not been king of Spain, just to be in Spain and try to rule England would have been extremely difficult. So these legates, these legates from the royals of England, were charged to make the request in the name of their sovereigns of the erection of Ireland into a kingdom, to which petition the Pope Paul IV acceded. So they wanted Ireland to be made into a kingdom. In fact, it was for a long time Ireland was under the control of the English crown. It was after the First World War that southern part of England broke off to form its own independent country, the Republic of Ireland. for a long time, the full name of the UK was, well, part of it was included in there was United Kingdom of England, etc., and Ireland. It wasn't something Northern Ireland, it was all of Ireland. In fact, to such an extent that during the war, Germany sent weapons to the Irish in order to foment uprisings, because the Irish wanted their independence even during the war. But the Germans sent armaments to the Irish in order to cause the British problems in their own territories. Again, that was in Ireland. There were uprisings in Dublin during the war. So, in any case, centuries before that, Pope Paul IV grants their petition to have Ireland made into a kingdom. An apostolic bull dated June 7th, 1557, officially recognized the title of sovereigns of Ireland, which Philip and Mary wished to assume. The ambassadors were then admitted to an audience with the Pope, and in the name of their nation, acknowledged him as head of the Universal Church. So again, they're still going through the process here of regularizing England as a Catholic nation once again. They presented him a copy of the act recognizing his authority, begged that he would ratify the absolution pronounced by the legate, and to confirm the bishoprics established during the schism. So they wanted him, though, at the same time to, whatever bishoprics had been set up during the time of Henry VIII and Edward VI, that those be formally made into bishoprics that Catholic bishops would then rule over as ordinaries. So the Pope granted all of those requests. Yeah. None of those things, of course. Ratifying the absolution announced by the legate, obviously there's no problem with that. Confirming the bishoprics established during the schism, that's of course well within the power of the Pope to do. So he wouldn't have probably granted all these things rather easily. But all of these marks of goodwill toward the royal consort of the English Queen, again keeping in mind that it was Mary Tudor who really ran things, did not in the least involve a change in the Pope's determination to destroy Spanish influence in Italy. So they're still fighting it out in Italy. So his family shared all his antipathy for Spanish domination, and feeling secure of its cooperation, he naturally turned to it for support. So in Italy, family is everything. Among Italians, family is everything. They're very much attached to their families, and so many politics dictated by family, and so on and so forth. Wars caused because of family loyalties. It was, in fact, his attachment to his family that Paul IV practiced nepotism, of course. He was rather bad in that, actually, which we're about to see. So, again, his attachment to his family and his thoughts of advancing their interests blinded him with regard to his nephews. So he wanted to promote his nephews, but blinded him to any considerations as to whether that would actually be in itself a good idea or not, and betrayed him into an error which he afterwards deplored bitterly. So he raised to the cardinalate his nephew, Charles Carafa, whose hostility to the Spaniards was well known. So, an enemy of the Spanish, in his political interests, he raises his nephew to the cardinalate, but this youth had none of the qualities which became a prince of the church. He had been trained into the rude and licentious life of the camp, so it sounds like he was a soldier, and had picked up all of the immoralities that soldiers are typically prey to. And his uncle committed a grave error by entrusting to him the conduct, not only of secular, but of spiritual affairs. So being a cardinal was, of course, carried with it a lot of worldly prestige at the time. Yes?
What was the name of this nephew?
Charles Carafa. So, of course, not only was that a bad decision in itself to raise someone to the cardinalate because of wanting to have more cardinals who were politically aligned with him, but that also, of course, influenced other nephews of his to adopt anti-Spanish sentiments because they saw that that would gain favor with him and they could be promoted also. They also, and it worked, they also received the dignities and offices of trust. So Paul IV, who it seems did actually want to bring about reform, and he wanted to keep the Council of Trent going and so forth, so he was very much, he did truly want to bring about reform, was indirectly favoring, or I don't know, it says indirectly, he favored very much one of the most obvious abuses, nepotism. So it was after those, we don't have time to look at all of the political things that went on during these reigns, but it was after he got over some of those political struggles that the Pope one day in a consistory, having turned his mind towards ecclesiastical reform, said the words, expressing his desire of what he wanted to do. He said, "Reform, reform." And one of the cardinals replied, "Holy Father, we must begin the reform among ourselves," which was a tact way of saying, you need to do that for yourself. Which was true. I mean, he'd said this cardinal, it's not specified which cardinal it was who said it. Darras doesn't mention his name, but obviously it came across, the message came across. What he was actually saying was, yes, reform is needed, but start at home, basically. So Paul IV understood that he was referring to the disorders of his nephews, which had been a subject of loud complaint among the Romans. So they were really a scandal. And having realized this, the sovereign pontiff made the necessary diligent inquiries and uncovered all the truth, all their misbehaviors. And with the proofs of the charges in his hand, the Pope met with the cardinals in an extraordinary consistory, made known this family misfortune, and decreed that his nephews, with their families and servants, should quit Rome within 12 days. So he brought them there and gave them all these positions in the first place, and now he's repenting of his nepotism. He's telling them to all get lost, essentially. Several of the cardinals would have interceded on behalf of his nephews, but the Pope forbade anyone to even mention their names in his presence. So he very firmly repented of his past nepotism. So when he had struck this blow, and the three exiles had left Rome, Paul exclaimed, "Now we can say, we must say, of our pontificate the first year," expressing his resolve to turn over a new leaf, as the saying is, on his papacy, that he's saying, okay, everything that came before, forget about it, and then we're starting again here. This is, in the history books, he wanted this to be seen as the first year of his papacy. Of course, too many things had happened before for that to be the case, but it was what he wanted. And that was, he wanted it to be as if a new beginning there. So now he gave himself up to with more fervor to the work of reformation, of ecclesiastical disciplinary reformation. He restored the Inquisition to Rome and fixed the limits of its jurisdiction. But these multiplied cares, responsibilities, and troubles added to what he already had in the weight of infirmities and advanced age, soon led him to the grave. So his newfound efforts to bring about disciplinary reformation, or disciplinary reform, led to his death. The exertions were too much for his age and state of health. So the year that he said would be the first was actually the last of his pontificate. He died August 18th, 1559, while repeating the words of the 51st Psalm, Laetatus sumin isque dicta sunt mihi, in domum Domini ibimus. So I would say, a sufficiently edifying death, repeating words of the psalm. And it appears that his work of reform made him unpopular at the end of his life, because after he died, the people burned the palace of the Inquisition and destroyed the statues raised in his honor at the beginning of his reign. And the same year was also marked by the death of St. Ignatius, who was, of course, rich in virtues and merits. So not everything's bad that happens during these reigns. But of course, as always, the study of church history is mostly the study of conflicts in church history. So now we look back to England. Of course, Mary Tudor died. She and Philip were unable to have any children, so the question was, who's going to take the throne now? So following her death, there was a new revolution, which placed upon the throne her sister Elizabeth, who was the fruit of Henry's adulterous union with Anne Boleyn. So once again, we see the irony of the fact that Henry VIII went through all that trouble, in part, and perhaps primarily, in order to get himself a male heir. His one male heir dies after a short reign, and then another, and after that, the fruit of his first legitimate marriage, his first valid marriage, comes to the throne, and then after that, not a male heir, but another female heir. Well, at this time, of course, the daughter of an adulterous union. That was truly an illegitimate daughter. So in the preceding reign, during the reign of Mary Tudor, Elizabeth, who had been trained in the principles and prejudices of Protestantism, gave, in fact, edification by her zeal for the Catholic faith. So she did everything externally the way a Catholic would do it. So not only did she appear with affected regularity, so it was exaggerated, definitely, at the celebration of Mass, but she even kept, in her private apartments, an elegant chapel, which was attended by a Roman Catholic chaplain. And she even had a confessor officially attached to her person. So she's, as the saying goes, she really went all out to appear to be a good Catholic. She didn't want to get in any trouble for being a Protestant. But privately and internally, what she was actually doing comes out as soon as she comes to power. Though Mary Tudor saw through it and had always doubted the sincerity of this outward conformity, and on her deathbed, solicitude prompted her to require from her sister an avowal of her real sentiments. So Mary was suspicious. Probably, it may have been that her outward show was quite exaggerated, which would make sense. For one thing, as we now know in retrospect, it was insincere, but it makes us especially sense knowing that. So sometimes people do seem to be a little exaggerated in their piety. It doesn't mean that all of them are secret Protestants, but in the case of Elizabeth, that was true. In fact. So actually, I read in one place that Philip II was instrumental. He was a prime mover in making sure that Elizabeth would inherit the throne of England. Of course, chances are he didn't really know her personally, and he did it for political reasons, but he thought that what he was doing was, for one thing, making sure that a Catholic would inherit the throne of England when it became clear that Mary would die. But that he did it for political reasons. I mean, political reasons, but that's a little outside the scope of what we're talking about here. But Philip II was very much instrumental in that. I don't even say a prime mover. He made sure that Elizabeth ended up as the heir to the throne, which, of course, he would bitterly regret to the extent, as we've talked about, of sending the Armada to try and overthrow her later on. But he was involved in it. There's no question. So Elizabeth, when required by Mary to make an avowal of her true sentiments, the hypocritical princess, Elizabeth, replied to that by saying, or by praying, Almighty God, that the earth might open and swallow her up alive, if she were not, in heart and soul, a true Roman Catholic. That's what she said. Of course, in retrospect, it merits the title of a horrible perjury. The first act of the new queen, of Queen Elizabeth, was to recall to court the partisans of the Protestant religion who had been removed by Mary. Those who had been confined for religious causes were released. The Bishop of Winchester was thrown into prison for his sermon at the funeral of Queen Mary, in which he maintained the necessity of reestablishing the Catholic faith in England. Yes?
How old was Queen Mary when she died?
Not very old. I have to check her exact age, but I want to say... I have to check. But not very old. Not very young. And this time was a time when it wasn't surprising that people would die young, also. But not very old. I want to say, again, I have to guess, I have to say not more than 50 when she died. But I have to check that. I have to check her age. Yes. No, they were not able to have children. Which is the reason why Elizabeth came to the throne. Obviously, if Philip II had any children who would have inherited the throne, because remember, he was required to give up the title of King of England after Mary died, assuming that she would outlive him. So most likely, in that case, if they had children, one of their children would have inherited the throne. And of course, that wouldn't have been any problem. But in fact, point of fact, they did not. They were apparently unable to have children, so Elizabeth ends up inheriting the throne, which Philip II thought was probably second best to having one of their children, of course, who didn't even exist, but having one of their own children inherit the throne. It's probably he had no problem with that. But as we're seeing, Elizabeth made her true colors evident very quickly. So those early signs were worrying indeed. But that which cleared away every doubt was a proclamation forbidding the Catholic clergy to preach in public and ordering the established worship to be observed until consultation might be had in Parliament by the Queen and the three estates. So Pope Paul IV had refused to recognize the legitimacy of Elizabeth, declaring that by right of inheritance, the English throne should have descended to Mary Stewart, Queen of Scotland, as the nearest lawful heir of Henry VIII. So Mary Stewart that we're talking about, not to be confused with Mary Tudor. Mary, Queen of Scots, she's also referred to as. Because if the Stuarts was a Scottish family, she's Queen of Scotland, she should have, of course, keeping in mind that Elizabeth is in fact illegitimate, she should have been the one to inherit the throne of England. Mary Stuart, Mary Queen of Scots, had married in 1558 the Dauphin of France, who would afterwards become Francis II, King Francis II of France. So is everybody familiar with that term, the Dauphin? It means, it refers to a certain, I believe, a duchy in France that a title went with it, but it was just generally referred to the crown prince of France, essentially. Like in England, it's the Prince of Wales, referred to as being the successor to the throne. Well, in France, the Dauphin is the heir to the throne of France. That's how you spell that. You can see that a lot talking about Saint Joan of Arc, that she went to go see. In English, it's often referred to as the Dauphin or something like that. I believe it has its own English pronunciation. But anyway, because she was the one who had to go to the King of England, or King of France rather, who he was supposed to be crowned. They had to retake Paris before he could be crowned, etc. But that's when you see that term very often used in talking about Saint Joan of Arc. So Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, was a sincere Catholic and would have carried out the religious policies of Mary Tudor, while her union with the heir to the French throne would have put an end to the hostilities which had so long divided the two kingdoms. And that's why Philip II wanted Elizabeth to become the queen. He didn't want an alliance between France and England against him. Again, we're not getting into all the politics of it, but that was why Philip II didn't want Elizabeth to become, that's why he did want Elizabeth to become Queen of England. As far as he could tell, given his political motives, Philip II's political motives, his political interests, and what he thought Elizabeth was, a true Catholic, it made sense for him to do that. Politically, it made sense. But Mary Stuart only found a death on the scaffold in England, so they killed her. They didn't want a Catholic ruler. So the bishops, the English bishops, alarmed at the tendencies of the new government, they clearly saw that it was headed straight back towards Protestantism and schism, assembled in London and determined to officiate at the coronation of the Queen, only on the express condition that she should take the accustomed oath to maintain the liberties of the Catholic Church. And Elizabeth did in fact take the oath, but this perjury cost her little, at least if she considers her soul to be worth little, cost her little. Certainly little in the temporal order. It was easy for her to just take that oath insincerely. But then, a few months later, the statutes passed in the late reign for the support of the ancient faith were repealed. So everything that was done to reverse Henry VIII's schism was itself done away with when Elizabeth came to power. And the schismatic acts of Henry VIII, in derogation of the papal authority, so in other words, the acts of Parliament that supposedly stripped the Pope of his power in England, of his ecclesiastical jurisdiction in England, supposedly, and consequently breaking off all connection not only with the Church and the entire Christian world, but also with the thousand years of Catholic England, were in great measure revived. So it's an almost complete return to the days of Henry VIII. Everything that Mary did to reverse this, the damage was completely thrown out. It was enacted that the Book of Common Prayer should alone be used by the ministers in all churches under penalties of forfeiture, deprivation, and death. That the spiritual authority of every foreign prelate within the realm should be utterly abolished. That the jurisdiction necessary for the correction of errors, heresies, schisms, and abuses should be annexed to the crown, with the power of delegating such jurisdiction to any person or persons whatsoever, at the pleasure of the sovereign. That the penalty of asserting the papal authority should ascend, on the repetition of the offense, from the forfeiture of real and personal property to perpetual imprisonment, and from perpetual imprisonment to death, as was inflicted in cases of high treason. That all clergymen taking orders or in possession of livings, all magistrates and inferior officers having fees or wages from the crown, all laymen about to do homage to the Queen should, so all those people, under pain of deprivation and incapacity, take an oath, declaring her to be supreme governor in all ecclesiastical and spiritual things or cases, as well as temporal, and renouncing all foreign ecclesiastical or spiritual jurisdiction or authority whatsoever within the realm. So essentially, Elizabeth requiring everybody to swear allegiance to her as the absolute monarch of absolutely everything in England. Ecclesiastical, temporal, absolutely everything. So, really quite a case of Cesaro Papism here. Everyone familiar with the term Cesaro Papism? No one knows that. It's a useful term. essentially referring to Cesaro Papism, so the Caesar part, referring to temporal rulers, and Papism, the idea that the temporal ruler is the head of the church. So you find that also in Russia. Cesaro Papism, the Russian czars were supposed to be the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. Cesaro Papism. So this is really a type of that. It just means any temporal ruler trying to be the head of the church. And once Father Cicada made the joke that the theory that instead of Roncalli it was actually Cardinal Siri who was elected in 1958. Father Cicada once called that serial papism. I heard that term before I even heard Cesaro Papism. Once I found the term Cesaro Papism, oh, that's actually funny. I finally realized it was actually a joke. And once I told that to Father Cicada, I mentioned that I just brought up the term serial papism. He said, oh, that's really funny. And I said, well, he was the one who said that. He didn't remember having said it. Okay, so again, Elizabeth making herself the Pope as well as the King of England, essentially, filling both those roles. Well, really, of course, usurping ecclesiastical jurisdiction. She was, of course, the temporal ruler, or became the temporal ruler, at the very least, by just having the power to boss everybody around, whether or not she was the legitimate ruler. But she came into possession of the temporal power in some sense, at least, and then claiming all full ecclesiastical jurisdiction also. So the English clergy opposed these bills with a vigorous but fruitless resistance, which does them honor, or is to their credit to some extent, of course, depending on how many of them actually stick to that or go along with it like most went along with it during the reign of Henry VIII remains to be seen. But at first they put up a resistance. There wasn't much they could do, but whatever they could do, they did it. They protested, certainly. They presented to the House of Lords, so one of the Houses of Parliament, a declaration of their belief in the real presence, transubstantiation, the sacrifice of the Mass, and the supremacy of the Pope, with a protestation that to decide on doctrine, sacraments, and discipline belonged not to any lay assembly, but to the lawful pastors of the church. And of course, all of that's entirely correct. So, at first, they're putting up quite a good resistance here. And not that I don't know if they had any real hope that it would make a difference, but certainly they're at this point, at least, they're doing their duty of professing the faith in the face of an anti-Catholic monarch. So both universities of Cambridge and Oxford signed the Confession of the Clergy, and the bishops unanimously seized every opportunity to speak and vote against the measures being taken by Elizabeth. To neutralize, or to dissolve or neutralize this disposition, the bishops of Winchester and Lincoln were committed to the Tower. So Elizabeth is hoping to now make an example of these two prominent bishops by imprisoning them, throwing them into the Tower of London, with the hopes that the rest of that everybody else would be cowed and cease to speak out against her as a result. Soon after that, Elizabeth sent for the other bishops, required them to conform to the new statutes, and on their refusal, drove them from her presence with expressions of contempt and resentment. The Oath of Supremacy was tendered to each in succession, but all of them, with the exception of one whose name was Landulph, sacrificed their situations and their liberty to the dictates of the faith. Our author says their conscience, of course, meaning their correctly formed consciences in this case, of course. But you just hate to say that today, is because it brings to mind Vatican II. But in this case, I mean, it is true. that their consciences were correctly formed. They saw, we have to oppose this. We cannot sign this oath. We cannot take this oath. And they followed that. They remained true to that. A few of them succeeded in escaping from prison and reached the continent. So probably not all of them were held in the tower, which is very difficult to escape from. Maybe some of them were held in a low security prison. If the tower was maximum security, maybe some of them were held in more like local jails or something. But anyway, some of them escaped and reached the continent, the mainland continent of Europe. Bonner, the Bishop of London, died in a dungeon after an imprisonment of 10 years. Watson, Bishop of Lincoln, languished 33 years in a dungeon of the Tower. And at the head of the intruded hierarchy, so in other words, the hierarchy that Elizabeth set up to replace the Catholics, so her newly reestablished Anglican Church had, of course, its own hierarchy. At the head of that, she placed a certain Matthew Parker, who was formerly the chaplain to Anne Boleyn. So the new primate succeeded, of course, not legitimately, the glorious archbishops of Canterbury from the past, among whom were saints such as St. Augustine of Canterbury, St. Augustine of Canterbury, not to be confused with St. Augustine of Hippo from the African St. Augustine, St. Dunstan, St. Anselm, and St. Thomas a Becket. Who's to see he was usurping, but he was the actual successor to the perjured apostate Cranmer. Remember Cranmer, the one who was secretly married when he declared Henry VIII's marriage invalid, and who first introduced the Book of Common Prayer, and who had reportedly had a profession of faith, of the Catholic faith on him, when that he was prepared to pull out if he thought it could save his life. But there was an unexpected impediment that arose from the refusal of the Catholic prelates to consecrate this new metropolitan. So remember that the See of Canterbury is the highest see in England. So the primatial see of England. So the bishop in charge of it, the metropolitan see, the bishop who has jurisdiction over a metropolitan see is called himself the metropolitan. So of course he's not receiving any jurisdiction in reality, because the Queen doesn't have the power to grant it, and of course the Pope is definitely not installing him. But Catholic prelates refusing to consecrate him a bishop, he was not a bishop to begin with, she wanted to consecrate him a bishop. So he was obliged to receive the right from two other bishops, whose names were Barlow and Scory, two bishops who had conformed under Edward VI. And then it is interesting that Dara says that since the consecration was performed according to the altered ritual, it may certainly be doubted that he received the episcopal character, and that he could validly confer it upon others. He was writing before the decree of which pope? Anybody know? Yes. Yes. Who declared Anglican orders absolutely null and utterly void. So, no room for doubt there. But yeah, that was towards the end of the 19th century. Darius wrote his book earlier in the 19th century, so he evidently wrote this before that it was actually a subject of debate before then. And we'll see it in a couple of years in church history, but Leo XIII was actually initially inclined to declare them valid. And there was a Cardinal Gaspari, a famous canonist, who thought that Anglican orders were valid. But it was Cardinal Mary Doval who basically made sure that Leo XIII declared them invalid. So it's interesting just to see how the human side of the church works like that. Of course, Leo XIII declaring them invalid, everybody has to accept that they are in fact invalid. But it's interesting that he was initially inclined to say that they were valid. But now we know for a fact they're not. So, quoting William Cobbett again, the author of the Protestant Reformation in England and Ireland, he says, after requiring all her subjects to take the Oath of Supremacy, offering them the alternative of torture or apostasy, this worthy daughter of Henry VIII, that's a good way to put it. Of course, not in the sense worthy in the sense of a good daughter, but a daughter who was worthy of Henry VIII. So Henry VIII was disgusting. She's disgusting too, so she's worthy of being his daughter. Essentially, that's what he's saying. Which is entirely accurate. Decreed the penalties of high treason against any priest who should celebrate the holy sacrifice within the limits of the kingdom. So essentially making it a capital crime to celebrate Mass. He says that the executioners were too few for the number of victims. And Cobbett says, my pen refuses to record all the atrocities which filled the world with horror. So he's a Protestant, and it was so bad I don't even want to write about it. So having overturned the altars and set up the tables, sounds like Novosordo, she compelled her Catholic subjects to attend into the churches of the new worship under enormous penalties. So it was very strict. In fact, I mentioned that one of the earliest English settlements in North America, that's in Virginia. I visited it. I saw they had to. It was a replica, like a reconstruction, because the buildings were very temporary. They just had to replicate it. But they built a replica of the church building that they had there. Of course, it was very bare, but apparently everybody was required multiple times a day to go into the church because they wanted to make sure that there were no secret Catholics among them. So he says, thus were the sincere and conscientious Catholics into the kingdom incessantly harassed, ruined by enormous fines, brought to the gallows, or compelled to flee from their native country. Such was the queen upon whom Protestant writers, and this is Darras again, have bestowed the title of great and good, and whom the Voltairian school would exalt to the dignity of a heroine. So everybody evil thinks she was really great, basically. Yeah, they do. Seriously, there's a kind of a nickname for her is Good Queen Bess. In all seriousness. Yes. Yeah, there are parallels there. Yes. All right, so now we'll take a look. So that's the state of England currently. The progress of Calvinism in France under the zealous care of Theodore Beza, whom we saw earlier as essentially the successor to John Calvin, was slow but sure, and was preparing lamentable disasters for the kingdom. So there would be wars of religion over this. The first meetings of the Calvinists were held secretly at Paris between the years 1555 and 1557, yes.
What did the church do with regard to those changes going on in England when they were turning everything back using common prayer?
Well, the Book of Common Prayer is, obviously forbidden to be used, is on the index of forbidden books. Everything, all of those Anglican rites had already been condemned by the church, even if obviously it would be centuries before Anglican orders would be definitively declared invalid by Leo XIII. There was already doubt concerning the validity of those orders. Therefore, there were a doubtful sacrament in the practical order is invalid, since it can't be received. You can't receive sacraments from someone who is doubtfully ordained any more than you can receive them from someone who is invalidly ordained. So definitely all of that stuff was already condemned by the church, yes.
So did the Pope take any measure against Mary and was there any degree?
Or that's Queen Elizabeth?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, she would. Maybe it hasn't happened yet, or our authors hasn't mentioned yet. But she was excommunicated. Because she was legally a Catholic. She was conforming to all the externals of the faith. Again, we've seen in an exaggerated manner, but still was conforming to all the external practices of the faith, going to Mass every day, had her own private chapel, her own personal confessor, everything. So, I mean, she was legally a Catholic, so it wasn't like she was already part of publicly at least, already part of a sect. So the Pope was excommunicated her, definitely. We just haven't had a mention of it yet. And also, going back to France now, to the Calvinists, Darius mentions that it's interesting to note that whether it comes in the name of religion or under the mask of philosophy, that revolutionary anarchy, which we've seen a lot of examples of by now, which always threatens to grind royal thrones and even just purely human greatness into dust. Of course, also they seek to attack the church, but it does definitely have the potential to grind royal thrones and human greatness into dust, always springs into being under the shadow of the throne. So these various temporal rulers don't realize the problems that are going to arise for them if they allow essentially revolutionary ideas to flourish, because they see some advantage in it for themselves. They don't realize that they're planting the seeds of their own destruction, if not personal, then at least for their dynasties later on down the road. So again, we're seeing that these Calvinists are holding their secret meetings in Paris, and at this point, not of course sanctioned by the king. It's not something that it's not like Luther in Germany being supported by the secular German princes. But at the same time, there are revolutionaries already in Paris. All right.